Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. Today, I want to share a little bit about what I've been reading and doing in the last couple of weeks. I call this often irregularly scheduled video series Reads and Rambles. Sometimes the rambles are through places I've traveled, and sometimes they're just about things I've seen as I've explored my neighborhood. Sometimes the rambles are through BookTube itself, where I talk about particular videos that have really intrigued me, etc. But this week, I'm just going to chat briefly about some of the things I've been reading in the last little while. The first book I want to talk about is Necessary Trouble, Growing Up at Midcentury by Gilpin Faust. While I read an advanced copy of the book, I believe its official publication day was this past Tuesday. I'd love to talk about this book in a lot more detail in a future video, but I want to mention it here because it transformed how I was thinking about what I was reading earlier this month. I've mentioned Faust before. She's the author of several academic but very accessible studies of Southern history, including the brilliant book This Republic of Suffering, Death and the American Civil War. She was my graduate school advisor. And afterwards, she became the president of Harvard University, the first woman to become president, and served in that role while my son was an undergraduate there. Her new memoir about her childhood in the U.S. South and her growing commitment to activism in the civil rights movement and other movements is a magical combination of memoir and history, focused on the cultural forces at work throughout the country and across the globe, forces that shaped the world she was born into. She puts her own growth into the context of the history of the mid-20th century, and she frames her analysis of that history with the context of her own childhood and young adulthood. The most powerful part of her book to me was her discussion of how she was shocked to suddenly see the world of racial hierarchy that surrounded her. As a young child, she had taken all of that for granted, never thinking to ask questions or even wonder about why her family and community functioned as it did. Again, I'll talk about this book much more fully in a future video, but what I want to talk about today is that we watch her as a young person suddenly become conscious of the fact that segregation and even racial violence was the bedrock of her society, completely surrounding her, but in a way that white people seem to take for granted, to accept without even thinking, not even realize sometimes. It made her angry, partly to see the injustice, but partly also because she felt lied to. Why hadn't people told her as a child what was happening? And then we see her, in her shocked state, become fiercely committed to working for change. At the same time I was reading Faust's memoir, I was reading A Gentleman in Moscow by Amor Towles. There was a lot I thought I would appreciate about the book. My husband David had told me how gentle a book it was, without any real conflict per se, but a man in a difficult situation who makes a full life for himself. It had become one of David's very favorites near the end of his life, so it felt like the perfect book for me when I pulled it off of his shelf. I was grieving, a little overwhelmed by the loss of the man who was my partner for almost 3 decades, and I too, like the main character, was trying to find a way to make my life feel at least in some way whole. But as I read those first few chapters, I kept getting frustrated by the main character's apparent unawareness of the larger scope of suffering in his world. He took his privilege for granted. In fact, it seemed to me that he felt clearly entitled to the privileges he was afforded at his very elite incarceration. Now, there is absolutely nothing wrong with the idea of novels exploring that kind of take-it-for-granted power and privilege. And I don't think I would always even want authors to hit me over the head with an analysis of what was going on and why it was possible. But I was thinking about Faust's memoir, And at the front of my mind was this issue, the necessity of not only becoming aware of oppression you might have always assumed was simply the way of the world, but also responding to it, fighting against it in oneself and in one's community. And I started getting frustrated that Towles was only showing us how the main character dealt with his own situation, not the social transformation that was happening in his midst. And of course, I kept wanting to talk to David about these issues. It hammered home the fact that for years I pretty much never read a book without talking about it in depth with my partner, even if he had absolutely no interest in reading that particular book. But let me say really clearly that I know I'm absolutely not being fair to either Amor Towles or A Gentleman in Moscow. But I decided, as did my buddy reader Kathy Grimm for different reasons, that this was not the right time for either of us to be reading this book. So I put it aside for a little while. Another of my current reads also fits in interesting ways with Faust's necessary trouble, and that is Absalom Absalom by William Faulkner, which I'm reading along with the amazing Faulkner and August discussion crew over on Voxer. It's a very active group full of brilliant people with brilliant insights, and I'm afraid I have barely been participating other than to read their comments. But I'm very close to the end of Absalom Absalom, and I'm planning to make a separate video about the book, perhaps next week. Technically, this is a reread for me, but it's been decades now since I originally read it. As I said, I'll talk more about the book soon, but it's pretty fascinating to me that Faulkner is, to a degree, trying to grapple with the way white Southerners were responding to that same shock that Drew Faust felt as a child. That initial moment of true awareness of hierarchy and privilege, backed up with violence, but so taken for granted that it had long seemed almost impossible for them to question until the Civil War forced them to. Of course, the white Southerners in Faulkner don't become activists as Faust did. Well, on to a book I'm really not going to compare to Faust, and that is the diverting little volume called George, a Magpie Memoir by Frieda Hughes. Hughes is the daughter of the poets Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes, and while the dislocation that she experienced because of her mother's death and her father's grief frames what Frieda Hughes says she wants and needs in her life, the two poets are not a big part of the story. Instead, we hear wonderfully warm and funny stories about Frieda's experience, hand-raising a spirited and opinionated bird in her own home, along with her beloved dogs, and a man who will soon be her ex. I listened to the audiobook of this one, read by the author, whose tone really intensifies the sarcasm sometimes, usually highlighting her great wit, but occasionally seeming slightly mean-spirited to me. Maybe that's just because I'm a Southerner. I listened as I went for walks each morning, and it was perfect for that kind of casual pleasure. Finally, I also want to mention that I read and very much enjoyed a new biography of one of my favorite writers. The book is called The Marriage Question, George Eliot's Double Life, by the philosopher and literary scholar Clare Carlisle. Her study is an interesting mix of an untangling of the details and meanings of Eliot's marriages, and a discussion of how Eliot painted various experiences of marriage in her novels. I won't say more about it here, but I published a review of the book in the online journal Open Letters Review, and I'll leave a link to it down in the description box below. Well, thank you so much for joining me today here on Hannah's Books for this short wrap-up of what I've been reading lately. I'll see you again soon.